Hey all, this is a 19th century number 4, and it is all about Impressionism. Yay! We finally got up to Impressionism. Okay, so last time we were talking about Manet and how he was kind of the bridge from realism and objective point of view in painting to to more towards art for art's sake in the design of the canvas and the subjective view of the artist. Um, but after Manet, the next person who really pushed that whole thing forward was this guy, who you all probably recognize. This is the work of Claude Monet. Monet completely broke from earlier previous tradition, and he was the leader of the actual Impressionist movement. Um, he was academy trained and greatly influenced by the artists who worked in this school in France called the Barbizon School, um, who worked outside and liked to paint directly from observation in nature. So they weren't painting in their studio, they were actually painting outside on location. He thought that was a really good idea. And he used what they could teach him about observing nature and recording a place. But soon Monet became more interested in the actual act of seeing rather than recording just what he was seeing. So this is one of his most famous early paintings. It's called Impression Sunrise. It was painted. It's a small painting, just a little under 2 feet across by about 19 inches, and it was painted in 1872. Did I say it's called Impression Sunrise? This is the painting that actually gave the movement its name. Critics didn't like it; they thought it looked unfinished. And they said, yeah, this painting is just an impression. It's not really a finished work of art. But Monet was very interested he was interested not in unified scenes or painting of objects. He was interested in that space that's between, the work was between the object and him. In this painting, you can see that he was a little bit influenced by Manet's use of little patches of color. Now, Manet didn't do it as extremely as Monet did later, but Manet, if you go back and look at Manet's painting in the PowerPoints, you'll see that the background. All the trees are painted in this very patchwork, very impressionistic, very rough way, and Manet was the first person to kind of do that, and Monet takes this to the next step. The paintings he did outside were kept kind of small so that he could paint them directly outdoors. And as you can see from this one, he was very interested in both the atmosphere, kind of like the atmosphere the way Turner liked the atmosphere, and also the reflections and the light and the way that the light and the reflections played off of one another. Here's a quote from Monet. "When you go out to paint, try to forget what object you have before you, a tree, a house, a field, or whatever. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here is a little oblong of pink, here a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives your naive impression of the scene before you." So Monet wasn't working to try to see the tree and form the tree, or see the boat and form the boat. He was looking to paint all of the atmosphere, all of the light, all of the water in the air that was between him and the object. He was very interested in all of this stuff that came between him and the objects and influenced the way he saw. So here, let's look at another painting of his that's a little tighter. Here's another painting of a summer afternoon on the river. I'm sorry, I don't have the title. Oh yeah, this is called The Highway Bridge at Argenteuil. And you can see here that his brushwork is still very, very loose, but it's a little bit tighter than the one before. And let's take a look at one more. I love this one. This one's called The Stroll. And this is a painting of Camille Monet and her son, Jean. It's called Woman with a Parasol. And Camille, of course, was Claude Monet's wife, and this was Jean, his son. And I think this one is a great early impressionist painting, because it really captures what Monet was looking for. You can see that not only is he painting a woman in a field, but he's also painting about the sunlight and the way the sunlight hits her, the way she's backlit, the way the wind is capturing her veil and her dress, and actually how the wind is moving in the grasses. You can actually see the flow of the grasses and the way the wind is influencing that. You can even see it in the way that the clouds look like they're moving. So this isn't just about a woman and a boy in a field. This is about sun. This is about wind. This is about the interaction of elements with all the physical items in the world that he's observing. So he's helping us see all of these elements better than we would see them ourselves, by showing them more clearly, more directly. It's super interesting. Let's take a look at the piece that is on the AP for Claude Monet. And this is called La Gare Saint-Lazare. And he painted this in 1877. It's at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, the best museum of Impressionist art in the world. And this is the Gare, is the train station. I'm sure you can tell that that's true. And Saint-Lazare is a suburb of Paris. It's just a suburb just a little outside of Paris. And most artists were not wealthy enough to live in Paris. It's a little bit like living in New Jersey versus New York City. And so they would work in their studios that they could afford in these suburbs that were just around the city. And then they would take the train in to the Paris cafes to meet in the afternoon, meet their fellow artists, to have coffee and talk about art in the afternoon. And so so it's kind of interesting, because the train station represents both kind of technology and these great forms of transportation that could get them quickly from an outlying area into the city itself, and also the kind of atmosphere and interesting effects that come from this technology. It's done as part of a series, and it was done over the course of a year, when he was living in Saint-Lazare, just outside of Paris, and he was using the train every day. So this was a scene he was seeing all the time. This painting is not a typical subject for him, because he tends to use objects, tends to paint things that are a little bit more idealized, like the beauty of nature, the beautiful people, all of that. So this kind of suburban scene of technology is a little bit unusual here. Okay, so here's your first question. I'm going to ask you I want you to as a group, and maybe work together, make a list of each one or two items, and talk about all the different textures that Monet includes in this painting. And there are a lot of textures. I want you to think about what's creating those textures. And if he really differentiates, does he differentiate between one texture and another? He might use different colors, but is he making something look vastly different from another thing? In other words, does a solid object look more solid than a non-solid object, and vice versa? And so tell me about the textures and what they represent, and answer me that question. Is he really differentiating between solid and non-solid objects? And if you think not so much, or even if you think too, tell me why. Why does he differentiate, or why does he not differentiate? This is one of the things I'm most interested about Monet. So as you're talking about the different textures, name what those textures are. So I also want to ask you a couple of other questions. What is the main way he composes this painting? Unlike our Baroque painters or our neoclassical painters, you'll notice that he doesn't use particular solid objects, bodies or buildings or anything, to really set up the composition of the space. Yeah, it's very, very different. And so he's not as interested in deep space. He's not as interested involving the viewer and having the viewer enter into any kind of a faux deep space, this illusion of space that our artists in the past centuries have worked hard to build. Notice how he doesn't care that much about that, which is really interesting. And I also want you to tell me if you think he is making any judgment about this scene. Does he think of this as less beautiful, more beautiful? Is there any judgment about this? Does he, how is he viewing this train station? I mean, because I think if you or I were to go to a train station, we might not view it very positively. It might be dirty. It might be full of like smoke. I don't know. So tell me about his impression of the train station and his attitude about this train station. So that's a lot of questions. You can answer a few of them, and that would be good. Okay, so as Monet goes through his career, one of the things that he received criticism for was the fact that his paintings weren't of anything important. We've seen the realists talking about social justice. We've seen the romantics talking about that. We've even seen the romantic landscape painters who were talking about manifest destiny or the sublime in the landscape, God in the landscape. But Monet didn't seem to be doing any of that. Monet was just he was just making these very beautiful paintings about the atmospheric effects of light and water on objects. And people started criticizing him as being a lightweight. His paintings are only about beauty, as if that's not enough, right? But thinking that they didn't have much substance to them. And one of the ways that he kind of addressed that, because he was sensitive to that observation, was he started making these series paintings of a same or similar object over time in different times of day, different times of different atmospheric conditions. And this series of haystacks is one of those, or is a part of one of those. And you can see that what he would do is he would take the same canvas. So he would take a canvas out at different times of day and he would switch it out. And when the conditions changed, he would stop working on it, put it aside, and wait until the conditions were similar again. And then he would pick it up and work on it again. So he was working outside for all of these. And he was carefully observing the conditions, the light and the way and the colors and the way the colors changed over, when it hit this particular condition. So it might take a month to finish one of these paintings, and he might make 10 of them at the same time, because he was just recording these changes as they happen, in the morning or in the afternoon or the evening. And so this way he was trying to make his work have a little bit more of a scientific approach. Here's another series. He did several of the cathedral in the portal of the Rouen Cathedral in the sun. Here's one. Here's another. And here's another. And you can see that he was very interested in the way the light played and even the color of the light at different times on this kind of neutral stone. So lucky for Monet, he was very, very successful within his lifetime. His work was beautiful, and he showed in the Salon de Refusé. And after initial criticism, he found a very appreciative audience. People loved his work, and he sold very, very well, even though it had totally broken from the academic tradition. And it was Monet and his colleagues that really helped set the academy aside, because the academy became irrelevant. People loved this work. They thought it was really something. And it's kind of interesting that even today, many years later, over 100 years later, we still love their work. People flock to see shows by the Impressionists. It is just gorgeous work. It's beautiful, and it fills museums, even with contemporary artists. Later in his life, he was wealthy enough to buy an estate in southern France, called Giverny, and he bought this beautiful, it wasn't a huge estate, but he bought a beautiful piece of land. It had a pond and a little bridge and a lot of trees and flowers, and this was his muse. This place was the place that he painted the whole last part of his life, and he stayed with his style, this style, throughout, throughout the rest of his career. Here, this is another lovely one of the lily pond. And just looking at the lily pond, the surface of it, it's interesting that you can see the sky reflected above, and you can see the trees that are reflected in it. And then you can see that he's painted the surface of the water. He's shown us the surface through the lily pads that sit horizontally across the water. Here's another one of that. And and I think it's very interesting that that his work got looser and looser and looser and more and less objective. It became much more about the brushwork, the colors, and less about the pond or the lilies or anything. His last paintings, the very, very big water lily paintings, you can almost not recognize any the lilies. It's all very, very. It's almost abstract. He kept going further and further with that. Okay, so we're gonna take a look really briefly at a couple other impressionists who are not on the AP, just because they're just so important and we can't skip them altogether. This is Edgar Degas. Edgar Degas was another impressionist who was trained in the same way, the traditional way. He gave it all up and started following Monet and the others. And his difference, the thing he was really, really interested in was people. And Degas was an upper middle class guy, but he really, really liked the watching and looking at people who were working people, like the ballerinas. His medium was oil, but he also sculpted, and he also worked in pastel. He was very influenced by Japanese prints. And I think this one is a really great one to just pause and talk with him a little bit about. Okay, I've got this somewhere here. Degas. This is called Rehearsal in the Foyer of the Opera. It was done in. Oh, I'm sorry. This one's called Rehearsal on the Stage, and this is pastel. It's dry pastel, so it's chalk pastel over a brush and ink drawing on thin cream-colored paper, and it's really interesting. I want to ask you, and you don't need to answer on the voice thread, but think about where we are, and he's given us a hint as to where we are. So we've said we're looking at the stage. You can see the stage, but notice how he placed us as a little above, and look at the dark object at the very bottom, almost middle of the canvas, and or the paper, and you can see where we are. You see that that's the top of a cello, two tops of a cello at the very bottom, which gives us the idea that we're actually above, sitting just a little above in a one of those balcony seats, not balcony, but those little side seats on the wall, that viewing down to the stage where the pit would be, where the orchestra would be. And he gives us that little hint there. And this is very much influenced by Japanese prints. Oh, I don't have this one. I wish I thought I did. Yeah, I don't have it. I don't have it close by, so I'll just go back to it. And I want you to notice that this is the rehearsal, and that's kind of interesting too, because Degas was very interested in people just being themselves, not when they were performing, but when they thought people weren't looking at them. And he really loved this. He loved viewing people in those little moments when they didn't think anybody was looking. And I want you to take a look at the yawning dancers, and the dancers who are waiting to go on stage, and the one tying her shoe, and the other one fixing her necktie, while these guys are out on stage dancing. And you can also see these two men that kind of look a little bit, I don't know, just, a little bit just kind of like, just creepy. They're sitting there all spread out on these chairs watching on the stage. They're not in the audience, they're actually watching on the stage, but you can tell they're not dancers, they're like business people or something. And this is likely some investors who are coming to get, to watch the production as they're rehearsing, getting a little bit of their money's worth for their investment. The pastel, chalk pastel he used this very lightly, and he used the short brush strokes just like Monet did, these very short little brush strokes that really broke up the surface texture of the painting, just like Monet does, and kind of giving this impression of light dancing off the objects, just like Monet. So it's the light is just lightly touching the objects in the way that light might do that. So the objects really don't look so solid. They look a little bit more slightly dissolved by the atmosphere. And here's a few more Degas paintings. This is a Degas sculpture, the little ballerina. And he also liked to watch the horse races. And again, he wasn't interested in the races. He was very interested in the jockeys and the horses at the time behind the scenes. This is a portrait that he made of his very good friend, Mary Cassatt, who was an American painter. We're going to look at her work in a minute. And these two were very good friends. And this is another. He did a series of women in the bath, and very beautiful. I mean, it's not so creepy because he's watching a woman comb her hair after having had a bath, because it's so very lovingly done. And even though she's not posing for him, he's definitely enjoying the form and shape of her as she reaches up and brushes out her hair after the bath. So this is again another one of his paintings that shows us about his kind of voyeuristic tendencies. Okay, so now we'll talk about Marie Cassatt. Cassatt was she was a really interesting person because she was an American painter, and she was unusual because she was a woman, and she decided to make a full career out of her art. She was born into a wealthy family in Philadelphia, and she first studied at the Philadelphia Art Institute, and then she eventually moved to Paris. And she actually brought her mother and her sister with her to Paris. She never married. She didn't want to marry. She didn't want to have a husband to have to take care of. She brought her mother and her sister so they could take care of her. And so she was like the man of the house in a way. She was the person who was earning an income and being out and about in town. And she was actually quite successful as an artist. She lived with them for most of her life. And when she first came to Paris, she was introduced to Degas, who kind of took her under his wing and introduced her to the other artists in the circle. He remained her friend and her mentor, and I think it's pretty easy to see his influence in this painting. This is a painting that she called "Woman in a Loge." Oh yeah, that's the name of the balcony. So the loge seat, and this woman was her sister Lydia. This is an oil painting, although I have to say Cassatt worked in oil and pastel, just like Degas. And she was also a really prolific printmaker. And actually the piece on the AP for Cassatt is a print. But let's talk a little bit about Lydia in the Loge for a second. Cassatt uses the same device that Manet did. You can see her, Lydia, the woman, sitting in her seat, and she's looking out into the theater. But we see the theater behind her because, of course, that's a mirror behind her. And you can actually see on her left side, you can see her back and her hair. So we can see and then we can see also the back of the chair reflected in the mirror. And so what we're seeing out here in front of her, or next to her head, is the rest of the audience that's sitting across the theater from her. And I think it's also plain to see that she's not looking down on the stage that's down below, watching whatever opera or whatever it is that's down there. She's actually looking at all the other people. which is, I guess, what half the pastime of going to the theater was all about, was seeing people and being seen. Uh, Cassatt was very interested in the life of a woman. Most of her work is about that. It has to do with what women did and what women's lives were like, and she was very much into portraying, from her point of view. Remember, this is all about that subjective. And so she thought, well, why can't women portray a woman's life? And she was extremely influenced by Japanese prints. And I'm going to show you this one. This is the AP piece. Okay, this one is called the coiffure. And it is an intaglio print. So this would have been done as a printmaking process. And if it is absolutely inspired by Japanese prints. This was a process that the Japanese used as well, not intaglio prints, but printmaking usually using woodblock prints. And I think you're going to notice, actually, let's let you notice. Taking a look at Cassatt's work, looking at this particular one, the coiffure, what about this is very Japanese? And why don't each of you mention something that is very Japanese about it? And hopefully you'll be able to come up with at least 8 different things. I think you can. And then the next thing I want you to think about is, what is she trying to say about this? Is this a big fancy coiffure? This coiffure is such a fancy word, like, oh yeah, I'm putting my hair up. I mean, when I think of putting my hair in a ponytail, I don't think of it as a coiffure. So that's kind of interesting. Why does she say that? And what is she trying to express here? Notice that our subject, the woman, faces away from us and doesn't seem to be noticing that we're looking at her. And although we get to have this kind of private peek into her life, you'll notice that even though she's not wearing a top, that it's not very sexual. It looks pretty matter of fact. And Cassatt has even played down her breasts and anything that would move us to think in that direction. It is very matter of fact. Why do you think that Mary Cassatt liked to work in prints? What was it? Think back. Why have artists use prints in the past? And if you say so that all the regular people can afford them, that's right. She was very much into the idea of art being affordable and not just for the rich and the elite. All right, so let's go through a few more of her prints. Really just lovely. And I think you can see strongly her style with this. Okay, another female artist was a French woman named Berthe Merzeau, who also painted the life of women. And we're going to pause here and just take a quick peek at this painter, and this is Pierre-Auguste Renoir. This painting by Renoir is one of his early, very famous paintings, and it is called La Moulin de la Galette. So it's an outdoor bar, and you can see that everybody is out there having fun and dancing. And this is actually one of the reasons why sometimes the Impressionists were criticized, because their subject matter was sometimes called lighthearted entertainment, not very serious, not very weighty, didn't deal with issues, more dealt with the life and the funness of being a middle class Parisian. He was one of the other major style setters for the Impressionists. He met Monet while they were still in school and was so influenced by him that he turned away from his earlier model, which was Courbet, and began working with these soft, sensuous, short brushstrokes. And you'll notice that Monet, even though that you can see Renoir's brushstrokes, but notice how different they are than Monet's. Monet's are pretty crisp. You can really see the edges of each stroke, whereas Renoir's are very soft. He uses clearly a very soft brush that gives everything a bit of a blurry quality. It's interesting. Um, Unlike Monet, who was very interested in the landscape, Renoir was super interested in the human figures, and he's got humanscapes and not landscapes so much. So I want to ask you really quick if you can find. So this is not a painting that has a big compositional shape. You'll notice that there's no big forms like we're used to seeing, like the offset triangle or the pyramid or circles or anything. This is what we call an overall composition. And instead of being held together by particular objects that are placed in such a way as to move the eye around, he's held it together by repeated pattern. And I want you, and you can name this on the voice thread. You guys, what is the pattern that holds this together? If you look at it hard, you'll start seeing it. And then I want you to name, so what's the shape, what's the pattern that holds it together, that is all over the whole thing? And then tell me all the different instances of it. Like it shows up in a bunch of different ways, the same shape over and over and over. Okay, tell me the shape and tell me some of the ways that it shows up in this painting. It's pretty cool. All right, I'm gonna keep us going. This one is awesome. It's at the Boston Museum of Art, and I think one of the things that I love about this is it really shows the motion. This one is called, this is the Luncheon of the Boating Party. It's a little bit later work of his, and you can see that it's not quite as big of an overall pattern as his earlier work, and in fact, he was criticized for that, so he kind of changed his tune a little bit, and later work as well. All right, so now I'm gonna move us on to, oh yeah, we have this guy. We're going to talk about this guy. This is Edward Maybridge. He's an interesting guy. Okay, now I need to find his work here. Okay, here it is. Maybridge. He's an interesting guy. Okay, so you can see he's a photographer, and you can see this particular piece. I'm gonna I'm gonna go back. All right, there we go. And this is a series of photographs that he made. It took him a long time to make it. So let's get you the backstory. He was born Edward Muggeridge in Kingston upon Thames, upriver of London. So he was like a northern Londoner. And he was unsatisfied with his life in this small English town. And in 1850, he left England to make his fortune in the United States. He arrived in San Francisco, California 5 years later in 1855. And the city of San Francisco had really only been settled about 5 years before that. So it was a lot of opportunity. It was full of opportunity. He set himself up as a bookseller, and then he changed his name to Mybridge from Muggeridge because he thought it sounded better, which is it does sound better. And then his most famous work began in 1872. And he during this time in the 1860s, he took up photography and he learned the trade from a daguerreotypist and worked for a photographer there in San Francisco and learned the trade. So in 1872, he was hired by this man named Leland Stanford. Now, Leland Stanford is the founder of Stanford University. You might know that school. And Stanford wanted to hire somebody who would take a series of pictures of horses in motion, like running, like galloping, hoping to prove something. Does anybody know what he was trying to prove? List it. Why don't you list it in the voice thread right now? And it will probably only take one of you to know. So Stanford was trying to prove something about the way horses ran. And so it was up to Mybridge to figure out how to do this. And so he knew he could use the camera, but he didn't know how he was going to capture enough pictures of the horse to prove this thing that Stanford wanted prove. So the way he did it eventually was he set up tripwires across the track where the horse was running. And when the horse went by the tripwire, he'd bump in, he'd run across the wire would pull and take a picture of him right then. So he would go, there was camera, tripwire, and as the horse ran along, it would take pictures of the horse in different at different times of his gallop. And that's how he that's how he ended up taking series like this. So let's take a look at I think, yeah, here it is. Oh, here it is. Okay, there it is. Let's see if we can play it. Oh, there it is. Check it out. Do you know what he was looking for? Okay, so it's kind of interesting because that wasn't a moving picture. That was a series of photographs that he took, and then he put them close together, and it became a moving picture. So Muybridge is the father of the moving picture. They realized that if you could take a lot of photographs close to each other in quick succession, that the picture could move, just like people could move. It was like a miracle. Well, it turns out that Muybridge was able to prove Stanford's point, and he was also got famous from this, which is really funny because he actually seemed like kind of a ne'er-do-well, a guy who was just gonna, come and try to make his fortune. So, and in the middle of all of this, he was charged with murder because he killed his wife's lover, and he was banned from the country, he had to go and come back. But even with all this trouble, he came back and did all of this. And so faster film, faster cameras with faster shutter speeds also helped with Muybridge's development of this kind of moving photography. And eventually, as you know, we were able to make moving pictures, and it was all thanks to Muybridge, which is kind of interesting. Okay, here's a few more that he took with Jaguar, a man running. All right, we're gonna go look for one more artist, and then this one is over. Here it is. One last Impressionist artist. I know Muybridge is stuck in there because he's not an Impressionist, but this guy's a sculptor who was considered an Impressionist. And this is Auguste Rodin. And this is his very famous sculpture called the Thinker. Impressionism had an impact on sculpture as well as painting, and it kind of revitalized the art form, because we'd have neoclassical, lots of neoclassical, but sculpture wasn't advancing, the style wasn't changing, it wasn't going anywhere. And Rodin was somebody who really took it into a new place, which is kind of interesting. It really revitalized it. Not since Bernini and in the Baroque period has there been such an innovative and influential sculptor as Rodin. He was rejected from the school of the Academy in France for 3 times, and he finally studied under a classical sculptor in France. But he was very influenced by Manet and the Impressionists. And I want you to look at the Thinker and think about, in what way was he influenced by the Impressionists? All right, I'm not going to make you answer that question. Let's look at another one. The Thinker was from a piece that he did called The Gates of Hell, and this this sculpture called The Kiss was also from that same, was a piece of study for that same series. All right, and the piece that's on the AP is this one. And this was a cast bronze sculpture, very large scale sculpture that was done as a commission for the French town of Calais. And it's called The Burghers of Calais. And it was created, it was a commission. They wanted to memorialize these burghers who are kind of like town officials, who sacrificed themselves during the 100 Years' War. So, and we'll talk about this one formally, and try to capture Rodin's impressionistic use of sculpture in this one. So it commemorated the Hundred Years' War and this really important event that happened in the city at that time. So it was King Edward III of England. He had overtaken Calais, but he offered to spare the city. And spare the people and the rape and the pillage and the death and all that. If 6 of the leaders of the city, the burghers, the town representatives, would offer themselves for sacrificial execution and give the keys, that King Edward, the keys to the city, while dressed in only in sackcloth and with ropes around their necks. So it was very specific. They had to dress in this very degrading way and give the king the keys to the city. And this is something they agreed to do. And they did this as a sacrifice for their town, so that the rest of their town could live. And in the end, the king spared their lives, and they did not have to die. However, the great sacrifice of these burghers was something that the town wanted memorialized. And so they asked Rodin to make a sculpture to remember, for the town to be able to remember these great men and that wonderful thing that they did. And now what Rodin came up with was this life-size sculpture. So this is a little bit larger than life-size. You can see that it's on a fairly low podium of these 6 burghers. And he didn't aggrandize them. He didn't idealize them. He didn't make them look greater than your average human. As a matter of fact, he made them look very, very human. I mean, just think about it. If you knew you were going to your death, how would you feel? And all 6 of these men knew they were marching to their death because they were sacrificing themselves so their city could survive, so their people would be okay. And Rodin imagined what that would feel like, and he sculpted them that way so that you could feel their sadness, you could feel their pain. So here's the question I have for you. I want you to look at this sculpture, and we can scroll through some of these slides. Well, I guess I'm not going to be able to do it this way. There we go. Here's a more oxidized version. I'm going to show you a bunch of these. And I want you to tell me how Rodin works with the shape, the form of the men, and the texture to express emotion. How does he work with the form and the texture to express the emotion? And what is that emotion? How does he express it? And what is it? What does he exaggerate? And what does he really, really play up? And in this way, again, he, instead of trying to show the very beautiful fine difference, think about Bernini and those soft, smooth skins and those flowing hairs and those robes, those gossamer robes that he was able to sculpt from stone. Well, here, he's not looking for that kind of fine texture. He's using texture in a different way. I want you to go through these slides and see how he's really transformed the figures to be able to express the emotion so clearly. Okay, so that's the question about Rodin. And that is also the last part of this. So I'm going to turn it off and stop recording.